So we are live, and we're going to start in a few seconds. Excellent. Very good. Right, so good morning, everyone. This is Sebastiano Tofaletti at the European Digital SME Alliance. Welcome to this event, this workshop on the European AI Act and digital SMEs, kindly hosted by MEP Tudorache, who's going to be speaking shortly. So let me just quickly introduce the topic of today's discussion. In April 2021, as you all know, the Commission published its legislative proposal for a European AI Act. This is a EU vision for ethical and AI and to strengthen users' control and choice with a view to set Europe apart in global competition. We want yet to ensure that Europe also supports AI innovation, AI development, and the uptake by European companies, especially SMEs. So we look forward to a discussion, a debate with MEP Tudorache, who's going to give us his welcome words in a few seconds. MEP Tudorache, as you all may know, is chair of AIDA, the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the Digital Age of the European Parliament, and is rapporteur of LIBE, the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs Committee of the Parliament, which is in charge of the file. So without further ado, Mr. Tudorache, I'd like to hand you the floor to hear your views on how we balance innovation and regulation with a view especially on SMEs.
Thank you very much, Sebastiano. I would really like to thank the Alliance for actually proposing this event to me. It came a bit natural, and I was happy to host it because of how important I think the SMEs for us as European ecosystem, economical ecosystem, how important they are, and how much of a duty, in fact, we have while regulating, not necessarily only the AI Act, but generally while regulating, how much of a duty we have as politicians, as regulators here to actually cater for their needs and for their expectations. But as I welcome you to this conversation, of course, since I'm also here in the plenary in Strasbourg, which is dominated by discussions about Ukraine, about the war, about what we do as Europeans, what we do more generally as the free democratic world, I think inevitably somehow maybe for part of the audience, the conversation today may appear off topic, somewhat misaligned with what preoccupies all of us in these days. But in fact, I would dare say it is not at all misaligned. Because I think what we need to understand that as the world changes, and I think that by now we all realize that the world over the last 10 days, 2 weeks by now is changing and has changed fundamentally. As priorities are being rearranged and as generally the worldview is changing, I think technology and the role that technology plays in powering up our economies, supporting our economies, but also in giving us strategic leverage in the world remains center stage. So I remain firmly convinced that just as I was at the start of this mandate of this parliament, when I advocated strongly for the establishment of the AIDA committee that you, Sebastiano, mentioned, the committee that I chair, and I did that. I did advocate for the establishment of such a committee because I thought then, just as I think now, that the way we as Europeans will position on the global stage on how we actually cater for the evolution of artificial intelligence, how we are going to write the rule book for these technologies for the years to come, will again determine not only how our economies will look like in 10 or 20 years' time, but also again what the role for us as Europeans in the world will be. So again, just to say this word at the beginning, that in this very crazy context that we've had over the last 2 years, I think this conversation and all of the focus that we are putting on this file remains very much aligned also with the higher political objectives. So I mentioned AIDA, and you mentioned, Sebastian, AIDA. Indeed, this was a special committee set up. I'm using already the past tense because we are 2 weeks away from fulfilling our mandate at the end of this month. We've established a special committee in Parliament, again, in recognition of how important this topic was, and to actually give, not only because we knew that when we decided to establish it, we knew that the AI Act was coming. The Commission had announced it, the white paper was already out, we had already contributed heavily as Parliament to preparing, in a way, the broader political framework for the introduction of the text. But we still insisted and wanted very much and wrote a very ambitious mandate for the special committee because, again, beyond the regulation itself, the text, we thought that there is a need to look strategically at artificial intelligence, to place it very carefully, mindfully in again in the bigger puzzle of how we want the union to look like in the years to come, and to very much look into the future, and to take every domain where AI has an impact and to try with the means that we have right now available to measure a bit impact, and to also try and forecast as much as we can what are the perspectives for the future. And therefore, what AIDA has done, in fact, throughout its 2 years of work, was to really take domain by domain those that were in agreement with all the political groups in Parliament were considered to be relevant. We've taken domain by domain, and we've organized hearings, we've written papers, we've talked to stakeholders to understand indeed what are these perspectives, how the future could look like, and with that to prepare us, in fact, for the work that we are starting right now with the preparation of the negotiations for the AI Act. I think we've never had, and I said it also in the first official hearing kickstarting the work on the AI Act, I said it then that I don't think we've ever been as Parliament as prepared, not that we are ideally and all geared up, but I think we've done, with the creation of AIDA, we've done the work of also educating ourselves as regulators the best we can in an area which would not naturally come to us as politicians as an expertise. So we've educated ourselves, we've gathered knowledge, we've gathered opinions, we've gathered points of view from stakeholders to be able to do now our work as rapporteurs, as shadows, in preparing the file, in preparing the first report, the position of Parliament, and then entering negotiations with the Council and the Commission for what will likely be quite a complex and long negotiation process. I'm prepared to actually cover the rest of the mandate with these negotiations. I don't think we will be able to finish quicker than that. Some points of substance, maybe, because again, we started by referring to SMEs, and I think it's very important to look at the Act itself, to look at its objectives, and to understand what it means for generally for economies, what it means for SMEs in particular. And I think it's evident. It was clear also from the Commission's outline of the proposal. We have, let's say, two stated objectives and another one which is not stated as such, but is, at least from my point of view, an evident one. The first one is indeed boosting innovation and uptake of artificial intelligence. This is something that we absolutely need to keep at the very heart of the work that we're going to do in the coming years as Parliament. I'm convinced that Council, or I'm hoping, I'm trusting that the Council sees it in the same way. We need to not escape this objective in every work and every negotiation that we have. Yes, rules are important. Yes, we need to make sure that we develop this technology in a human-centric way. And that, as a rapporteur for LIBE, is going to be my central preoccupation in these negotiations. We need to understand that this technology has hazards which need to be safeguarded properly. But again, the main objective, well, let's not say main, let's not categorize them or rank them, but a key objective has to remain always that we write this regulation in a way that boosts innovation, in a way that supports our economic environment, supports particularly small and medium enterprises who are the engine of our economy and who need to be the ones uptaking this technology, feeling emboldened, getting the courage to actually work with artificial intelligence, to innovate in artificial intelligence, to introduce it in the various other products or technologies that they develop. So that's number one. Number two, as I said it, again, without ranking them in any way, but clearly the other objective that the Commission had in mind was to ensure safety. And not only in a way, I know that for some, looking in a way very simplistically at this text, they say this is a product safety regulation. It is not just that. Yes, it is, let's say, or you could look at it as a bit part of a bigger puzzle that we already have at EU level for ensuring product safety, but it is safety in a much broader sense, with the understanding that this is a technology that actually impacts our livelihoods in a much more profound fashion than maybe any other piece of technology up to now, that it can have impact on the cohesion of our societies. I would go as far as that, into the health of our democracies, because of how algorithms of social media influence the way we relate with the world, but also has impact on very precise individual rights if we think of social scoring or any other type of algorithms. So again, in recognition of this reality and of this deep impact on freedoms, on liberties, on us as human beings and our interests, then again, a second clear objective that the proposal has is to surround those parts of the technology which bring about these risks, to surround them with some rules, with transparency obligations, with explainability, so that again this development and this technology is done in a way that does not harm our interest. And there is a third objective that I mentioned at the beginning, which is not stated as such in the text, but for me it's obvious, which is let's say the more geopolitical objective, because this regulation does not come in a vacuum. It's not going to just land here on the European soil and just deal with what we do here. It will have inevitably a global effect. And therefore, I think one of the objectives that we have to always keep in mind when we work on this text is the impact that it has outside the EU borders, and also how it plays into the global AI race, let's call it this way. How will we ensure that other like-minded partners out there in the world align with the objectives that we have, and also in the way we're going to draft these norms? How will we actually arrive at common standards? And now, if I come back to where I started, with the role that technology now has, also as a geopolitical tool in a new reality, which is caused by the war of the last 2 weeks, it may become very, very relevant that the standards that we set in this technology are standards that are shared, recognized, uptaken also in other corners of the globe, so that we can make sure that this technology, at least for this part of the planet, evolves in a way that again matches with our values. now going a bit more concretely on, let's say, the innovation part and the impact on SMEs, because there were some very concrete topics and questions that you were putting in, let's say, in my brief for today, which is innovation versus regulation was first. And it's true, one could easily say, well, how could you say that you want to increase innovation? How do you want to say that you support SMEs? In fact, when you come and you put rules, rules are in fact stifling innovation. Rules are in fact creating barriers, putting burdens, particularly on SMEs. And in fact, what it does, it just prevents them from creating. And it can easily be true. And this is why I was saying at the start that we absolutely need to be mindful of that and make sure that we don't, with the rules that we put in place, we don't create that effect. And I think that with the risk-based approach that the Commission has taken, which I very much support, I think it's meant to ensure just that, to basically not condemn entire sectors or condemn by default in abstract certain type of applications to compliance and to regulation and to heavy burdens, but to actually look very concretely only at the effects, at the consequences that a particular application may have. And then if those consequences are of a certain nature that impacts rights and freedoms and human interests, then it triggers certain obligations and certain compliance requirements. And I think that's the only way that this particular technology could have been regulated. And again, I think what we will need to do now as regulators is make sure that when we look at those categories of high risks, we make sure that we stay as confined as possible. And again, we don't put unnecessary barriers to those that don't need and to have them, because the tools that they develop, the applications they develop, the algorithms they work on, the AI that they do are not in those categories that require regulation. A second element that I would mention is sandboxing. Sandboxing, which I see as a fundamental, and I would make sure in the negotiations, I actually want to strengthen those provisions related to sandboxing, particularly because I think they're an important tool to ensure competitiveness for the SMEs. Compliance is not a very difficult task for big companies, for big established players. They can easily hire another small army of lawyers and make sure that they actually stay compliant. It is a bigger burden and a bigger challenge for the small enterprises, for the young engineer with a bright idea who wants to develop something. And if we are to ensure an equal or as much of a level playing field for everyone to be able to create, innovate, and be competitive, then we need to ensure the frameworks in which this can happen. Of course, we have hubs. And now also as part of the new financial instruments in this new cycle, there is also quite a sizable amount of EU funds that is going into these hubs, but which are also creating the right environment because it puts testing capacities, it puts computing power, it puts all sorts of other elements, training at the disposal of SMEs so that they can actually go and use those facilities to stimulate their ideas, to play with ideas, to test ideas. But having a safe environment where you can actually engage in trial and error with a regulator, test your idea there, play with data, again, in a controlled environment, I think that's a very important tool for the SMEs to use. And that is why I think what we need to do with this regulation is to make sure that these sandboxes are happening more or less in the same way in every member state. I don't want to see, because the way, if we have to looser rules on how sandboxes are to be created, my fear is that member states will implement them differently. And then if you are an engineer in, I don't know, in Romania, Bulgaria, or some other corner, and then in another place, the understanding is different, then the access to these tools would also be different. And then that level playing field is no longer there. That is why, again, I would want to strengthen these rules around sandboxes so that they are actually implemented more or less in the same way. that the authorities would relate to these sandboxes in the same way and invest in a similar fashion in their evolution. And the last thing, and sorry, I've gone a little bit too long already, the last thing that I will mention is governance. I think we, again, owe it to the SMEs to have as much of a coherent governance as we can. Right now, the text is not coherent. The text as it stands, I'm convinced, will create 27 different markets instead of actually consolidating the digital single market. If we're going to have 27 different regulators who are going to play as they understand it with the same set of rules, again, we're going to have tremendous fragmentation. That's my opinion. And that is why we will need to reconsider governance. And there's going to be something that in the course of these negotiations, I will be advocating for strongly. We will need to reconsider the governance in a way that actually, again, gives coherence and clarity across our market, across the European market, for economic operators, for SMEs, small, medium, but even for the bigger ones the same way, to have access to the same understanding of the regulator on how they apply the rules. Again, otherwise, we're going to have a tremendous fragmentation effect, which is not, again, going to help our businesses. So, sorry for already taking too long. Again, don't get me started talking about these things. It's hard to stop. I'll stop here, Sebastiano, giving you back the floor, and of course, remain available for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tudorache, Dragos. It was a very inspiring introduction, and I think it will certainly help us frame the discussion of today. You mentioned very many interesting aspects, and I'm sure we're going to have a long discussion about that. In the meantime, we have more than 80 people who are following the event live are in the room with us. The event is also streamed via Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and we have probably a larger audiences over there. But those who are in the room with us, ideally, will also take the floor and have a interactive discussion later on. We're going to soon start a panel, but I would like to invite everyone who's also joined with us in Livestream to participate in the discussion. From my point of view, just a couple of words to kick off the discussion. Perhaps, as you all know, in 2020, our organization, the Digital SME Alliance, launched a focus group on artificial intelligence, which today brings together almost 150 top SMEs in Europe, which are providers or developers of artificial intelligence. From the start, this focus group was asked to identify key hurdles for the AI uptake, for the innovation uptake in Europe, and they mentioned mainly three things. Number one, lack of funding. Number two, lack of access to data, insufficient access to data, and number three, lack of talent. I think it is quite clear these are the main issues that SMEs are concerned with today. So while most of these companies agree that we should have an ethical approach on AI, of course, and appreciate that Europe wants to become a front runner in setting such rules, there is growing wariness that the chosen approach with this AI Act may go too far, perhaps. So a highly regulated approach may limit the innovativeness of SMEs. Why is this the case? Because SMEs often provide tailor-made solutions and agile software development solutions, including AI applications, rather than the typical off-the-shelf, vertically integrated solutions that are provided by big tech. So there is a very different model in SMEs compared to big tech. So over-regulation and standardization as such, therefore, threatens a little bit such business model by the SMEs, as it prescribes one correct approach where there may be several possible approaches. This is especially true in a not yet very mature environment such as the AI applications. So if Europe moves too fast towards a standardized and highly regulated approach, this will likely push many SMEs out of the market, even if we know that these SMEs are the most innovative and they provide the best solutions, but simply because they cannot comply with such a regulatory approach. So I don't want to anticipate too much the discussion of today, and so I'll prefer to leave our companies to speak. We have many SMEs who are with us. And with that, I'd like to hand over the floor to Andrej Klemen, who is gonna help us moderate the panel discussion today. So Andrej, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastiano. Good morning, everybody, from my side as well. And indeed, as Dragos said, the context for the discussion may be a little bit awkward, but there is huge connection in my view as well. Technology, as Dragos has put it very, very well, is now part of our everyday life. And what we are discussing here today, it will impact the new world that has been, initiated with what is happening now in Ukraine. We have seen that a front of the battle is carried behind the scenes in a cyber, let's say, environment. And I'm absolutely sure that AI will play a role in all these conflicts that are now part of our life, unfortunately. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Digital SME Alliance, for inviting me to moderate this very interesting discussion. I will start by giving the floor to our speakers, our guests. With the exception of Dragos, who has been already introduced by Sebastiano. And I cannot but help to remark that we are 3 Romanian nationals here. I don't know if this is a coincidence or not, but that gives me the opportunity to invite first Emilia to present herself. So Emilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrej. It is an honor being here and being part of this important exchange for SMEs. I'm Emilia Tanta. I'm the Chief Data and Artificial Intelligence Officer of Black Swan Lux, which is the second spin-off of the University of Luxembourg Interdisciplinary Center for Security, Reliability and Trust. We were built in 2015. Our first product is an AI-based anomaly detection core running on wearable devices, Save Life app. And being dedicated to personal safety, trust in AI is one of the main components. Thus, we focus on building the instruments of trust in AI for us and our partners and clients. And we do so by actively engaging in standardization and scaling our services as to support certification and conformity assessment, which is quite rare for an SME to be active in standardizations. This requires time and resources. And we'll come back to that later. We welcome the AI Act as a needed initiative in Europe, as it will provide pragmatical instruments of trust. And in the same time, of course, we align and we fully support the Digital SME white paper and the open points, as discussed representation of SME voices in standardization, or the cost which will be induced by preparing conformity assessment as a seal of trust. Although I'm acting as the convener of the Working Group 2 in the CEN-CENELEC Joint Technical Committee 21, which is working actively in providing technical support standardization for the AI Act. A second point that we see is a needed point is early access, and it was tackled by Dragos earlier, ensuring that regulatory sandboxes will be constructed with SMEs in mind and ensure that as such SMEs have a voice. They are small entities, but we do support the European resilience. That would be on my side. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Emilia. We will move now quickly to Thomas Beck. Thomas, please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Thomas Beck. I'm really honored to be invited today to this event. And yeah, I think I can connect to many of the things that have been said already, but let me introduce myself briefly first. So I feel qualified to say something here because I'm both a professor of artificial intelligence, professor of computer science, and at the same time, I'm also an owner and CEO of an SME that actually develops, operationalizes, and deploys AI technology for industrial R&D and for manufacturing processes, for production processes. What I see is that we are pretty special because we are really a true SME without any external investor, any funding that comes from the outside. So competing and striving, trying to strive in the open market and growing organically. So I think that qualifies a little bit for saying, well, how this might affect SMEs. Let me state very clearly, though, I am absolutely for regulating high-risk applications of technology. And I would like to say very generally technology here, because I think it doesn't only affect artificial intelligence. And I would like to comment later on that a little bit more specifically, because I think that's an important point. What we see in our business practice is with a small company with 8 employees, that there's already an enormous number of rules and regulations imposed by customers, by local authorities, by governments, and of course by the EU. And when we answer a request for proposals, for example, from clients, and trying to win the bidding competition, that's really determined by often offering, I must say, painfully low daily rates. And at the same time, we have, of course, highly qualified staff. So that's an observation which was striking, because many people seem to believe that artificial intelligence is like selling by itself, but that's not the case. And I think this is really an important observation from the side of SMEs. What we see is that there's competition from multinational and global companies who have no difficulties with any kind of certification. That we also see competition from national research organizations and universities, meanwhile, because both of them often have a competitive advantage in being supported through governments or funding agencies. And third, the competition is coming from SMEs outside of the EU. And in this environment, it sometimes is really complicated to survive and strive. And I would like to also discuss a little bit later on the impact that certification requirements already by now have on SMEs, because we just recently went through one of those certifications. And I would like to focus a bit on the technology side and the high-risk applications mentioned in the Act as well, because I believe that the technology definition, as we see it right now in the Annex 1, also needs some refinements, because it might be quickly outdated and it's also not completely appropriate, in my honest opinion. So that would be something that I would like to comment later on a little bit more. Thank you very much for the opportunity for being here. And let me state this again. It is really important that this is being regulated and that certain applications of AI are not only being classified as high risk, but they are also not allowed at all. So with this, I would like to hand over to you again.
Thank you, Thomas. We will move now to David Haber. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andre, and thank you so much for the invitation to this panel. I'm a computer scientist and an AI developer, and the reason why I believe I can contribute something to this discussion is because I've built and scaled AI for startups for the last 10 years, and actually always found myself in regulated industries and have learned a thing or two in terms of just how difficult that can be. And I think that what we're discussing here today is, in my view, probably one of the most important topics for Europe and the world in the next couple of years. But what I'm also very excited about is that we are in a position where we can get AI right now. And that is both on a technical, but also on a regulatory level. So a bit more about myself in that direction. I've most recently founded a company called Lakera, an AI safety company, where we combine years of deep practical AI experience to equip developers with the tools needed so that they can build trustworthy AI. And I liked Tudorache's mention of the sandboxes, where we are also providing a software solution to the idea behind that. Now, why is this all important? I think there are many obvious points, but from our perspective, we experienced firsthand that it is one thing to define regulatory requirements. It goes all the way back to the high-level expert groups, trustworthiness guidelines, I believe almost 5 years ago, and another to actually build AI applications that fulfill these requirements. And looking at the AI Act, there are so many interesting elements in there where we as developers ask ourselves, what do we actually mean by that? We talk about fairness. What does that mean in the context of a specific application? How do we quantify that? Do we talk about error rate balances, equalized odds, causal discrimination? It's really not that clear. Technical robustness and safety, which is mentioned, what does that mean? I don't think, for example, that proving robustness to adversarial attacks is where we need to necessarily start today. And more importantly, all of these directions could potentially require massive resources from a development perspective. So I'm really talking about the impact this has on AI development teams. And so it goes without saying that I'm also particularly worried about the additional burden that this could potentially put on SMEs and startups, those that work on the group of friends that puts together an exciting idea and wants to implement that, bring that to market. And so with Lakera, we provide the software to alleviate that burden. But I'm also happy to discuss a lot of the other details in more detail today, because as part of our work, we do speak with a lot of SMEs across industries and see firsthand every day, every week, what the information uncertainty and what the challenges are for them. But maybe I'll stop here for a second and give the microphone back to Andre.
Yes, David, thank you very much. Indeed, a lot of things already mentioned by Thomas and by you, David, that you would like to address a little bit later. I hope we will have the time. We will move now quickly to Mislav Malenic. I hope I pronounced correctly your name. Mislav, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'll just say that for the last 17 years, I'm in the field of AI. First 5 years as a scientist, last 12 years as entrepreneur. I've spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, some time in China, and most of the time actually in Europe, building startups. And I would say that's like, and I'm also the president of Croatian AI Association that's very active in regards to everything associated with the AI Act, and first with the white paper and so on. Why? Because I really think that's such an important topic, and I'm not sure that we are doing everything that we can do actually to create an environment that's innovation friendly. And why am I saying that? Not because someone is doing that deliberately or something like that. It's more because I'm not sure that we understand the process of innovation clearly, and especially that we understand it in the field of AI. And the thing, like the most obvious thing that I saw or that we identified is that people think that AI products, especially innovative AI products, that's something that you can build in your laboratory or like in some kind of like a government regulated sandbox. And then once it's good, once it's tested and so on, then you push it to the market. And my company, for example, we're building autonomous systems that are helping like millions of people to make decisions about their health, about their finances, about education, and so on. And I also have friends who are building autonomous vehicles. So autonomous driving and so on. And I can tell you that you cannot, if you train or build your autonomous car on your parking lot or in some safe environment, the only thing that that autonomous vehicle will know how to do is actually how to drive on your parking lot. And when I see an AI Act right now, and when I talk with my investors, when I talk with other startups and so on, we just see a lot of uncertainty. We see fear. Basically, we won't be able to get funding here, that our process of innovation where I need to test like 1,000 things before I'll find one that really works, really creates value, that can really be scaled and so on. That's not something that's supported here. When I read AI Act and I don't see startups being mentioned anywhere, and startups are like main vehicles of innovation, I just think that a lot of these things were actually being written without really being anyone being consulted with people who are building AI innovation. And when I hear that we are working on standardization, I say, yes, it makes sense for a lot of things that are digital because we have already 30 years of experience using digital products and we can standardize a lot. But when we are trying to standardize AI innovation without actually having it here, without actually having really big industry, without having actually best practices and so on, I just find it very arrogant. And for example, both my startup, both myself and like Croatian AI Association, we are really pushing strongly for how to educate decision makers, how to educate people about like what's dangerous about AI, because a lot of people don't understand what's dangerous about AI. Like people just say, oh, there's high risk applications. That's bullshit. There are like high risk setups that are reckless, where people actually didn't do things that they should, and they should actually have consequences because of that. But if, for example, AI is dangerous if you have, I don't know, mistake in your algorithm, and that's something that works on like 1 billion people, and you do them harm. That's dangerous. But if you are assisting doctors in a closed environment, closed setup, where you have human oversight, where like standards are much higher than a regular practice, where you have a human who is also biased that no one actually controls. And I just don't see that anywhere in this document we understand these things, and that we are actually. So what I think, if this document becomes in this form, if it becomes something, a standard practice, what we'll do in Europe, we'll create a new market, and that's the market of AI products based on fear. So like how to avoid actually being punished by the government, how to avoid being sued by someone and so on, instead of AI products based on inspiration of like what we really can build and what kind of new value we can actually create. And I can tell you immediately that we are really stifling innovation, because it's not about like 10 companies and actually giving them right conditions to succeed. It's about giving like thousands of new startups a chance to try something, like as easy as possible, and then finding something that works and helping actually to scale that. Because what will happen, we'll actually, and we already started to do that, we'll import technology for autonomous driving. Why? Because no one can actually build it in Europe. Not because there's lack of talent, because there's just no good conditions to do it. In China, you have a whole city dedicated for building autonomous driving. That's a competitive advantage that China gives to their entrepreneurs if they want to do something. And then we have European companies going there, opening companies there, because that's the only place where people do really understand what you're trying to do and support you at that. I have numerous friends who have startups who would just tell me, look, I'll go to Brazil, because in Brazil, I know that I can test things, I can build things, and I can do it quickly. And then once when I have something, then maybe I'll return to Europe. Otherwise, I just cannot take this risk of uncertainty that because I'm here, that I won't be able to do something. Okay, so I'll stop here. I just wanted to add a little bit of substance to the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Mislav. Indeed, important points that you have made. Some are painful, I know, and I think everybody here acknowledges that, painful points that you have raised. Let's see if we can do something about it with the means of that we have in this little discussion that we organize here. A couple of things from my side. We will have a round of questions for everybody, actually 2 rounds of questions for everybody here. I would like to build on what has been said already by some of you in the opening. And then at the end of the event, I would like to give the floor also to people who are in the room here with us. Maybe they have different views, different angles that need to be addressed. So going back to the questions, Dragos, you heard a lot from the previous speakers. There is a lot of concern related to the stifling effect of the regulatory framework. And you also heard a lot the word innovation. How do you see the Parliament's role here? What do you think the Parliament can do besides the regulatory role, which is quite obvious, to encourage, to support, to foster innovation among European SMEs? Some say that we are losing already the battle on a global level with the US and with China, and Mislav gave a good example, I would say, why this is happening. So what do you see that we can do as a European Union, and especially the Parliament, to correct or help or encourage more innovation in the business environment in Europe?
Well, thank you, Andrei, for the question, and thanks to all the contributors for their experience and very important, very practical and down-to-earth contribution to the conversation. You said, Andrei, that we are about to lose the race. Well, one could also say we already started badly or lost the race already a couple of years ago, because, and this would be the number one factor that I bring in, which is money. You mentioned it yourself, or I think Sebastiano mentioned it in his introduction at the beginning: money, data, and talent. So if we are to start with money, the reason why we are lagging behind in the global race is because so far we haven't really put the right amount of money next to this rhetoric, political rhetoric, that we believe digital is important, that we believe AI is important, that we believe that competitiveness in these areas is important, and that we want to be out there playing with on equal footing with the US or with China. It's enough to look at the amounts of investment over the last 10 years, and you could see US is there, China is there, and somewhere a little bubble, you have the amount of money that the Europeans have put next to it. And this is the first, let's say, thing that we can change. Asking what the Union can do and asking what the Parliament can do is to at least up a bit the game by putting more money next to this political ambition of being competitive. And okay, I personally, I'm not happy. I think we should have put even more money in the financial cycle for the 7 years ahead of us, 6 remaining. But still, it is way, way much better than what we've had in the last cycle. And it's not only the amounts that we've put as European Union in the programs that the EU is funding, also governments are waking up to this challenge and are putting national money. They are creating national programs, not all member states in the same way, unfortunately. And this is also something where the Commission is trying to instill the same level of interest, of political interest in the member states, so that the governments also put themselves national money in this area. You also saw that as part of the RRF, the recovery fund that we've, as the European Union, we've put together to compensate the effects of COVID, the important threshold of 20% which need to be invested in digital. So again, that's the first thing, money. And I think, again, we need to do more, but still, if we manage to at least properly and smartly invest the money that we have allocated as it is, it would still be a much better, much more conducive to instilling innovation, to encouraging innovation, and to fund innovation than it was before. The second element, as far as innovation is concerned, is talent. Again, you mentioned it also yourself, Sebastiano. I haven't heard it from the other contributors, and I would actually be curious to see what they think as well. How easy it is for them to find talent right now in Europe, to find the skills and retain the skills. I think already finding the talent in itself is going for the next 10 years. I think growingly going to be an issue. I think the gap between what our schools are producing in terms of digital skills and talent and what are the needs in the market, the gap is widening, which means that we have to start thinking at the level of the education ecosystems in the member states and at EU level. We have to start thinking of how we compensate this gap. So how we draw more and more of our young students, young pupils to actually go into education, higher education linked to digital, and particularly for these sort of niche cutting-edge technologies, which are going to be the key contributors for economic growth in the decades to come. And then, of course, how do we retain this talent? Because that's another painful reality that I'm sure most of you or all of you are aware of. And I think Mislav was also relating to it to a certain extent, which is that a lot of our talent is actually going abroad. Why is it going abroad, and why isn't it not interesting for them to stay? And then here you have a myriad of reasons. One of it being, as Mislav was saying, one of it being that many of our engineers might find that it's not actually interesting enough. It's not sometimes even a matter of money or having access to funding. It's simply not interesting enough. Maybe it's not creative enough. Maybe indeed there are too many burdens for the kind of ideas that they have, for the kind of pace that they would like to see imprinted into the business that they have in mind, and therefore they choose to go somewhere else. They choose to go to the US, or they choose to go to China or to Brazil or anywhere else, just because, again, the conditions, the environment in which they are forced to operate here is not something that they find encouraging. And I think, again, we have to address this issue of retention of talent, because if we don't, then there is a very big, serious thing that we cannot compensate with anything. You can't compensate this with money or with political will or with legislation or with anything else. If we stop being attractive as a market, as an environment for the talented people that are around us. Speaking of the importance of regulation, or let's say in the negative sense that regulation can be detrimental to stimulating innovation, I think in abstract, yes. I think any burdens that come from rules for someone who just wants to create and be left alone to create and be given maybe also the proper environment to do it would feel to be a burden. But I think that with the right balance, and here I don't necessarily agree with everything that Mislav was saying at the end of his contribution. Why? Because I think that if we look at this text, and I'm not here to defend it, but if we look at this text, I think it leaves room for creativity. We can still play with it, and certainly in the negotiations to come, we are going to play with it. We are going to try and narrow down as much as possible those aspects of the text that might be unnecessarily putting burdens on SMEs. But overall, what we have to understand is that the vast majority of applications would completely escape regulation. The definitions of the high risk which are the ones that are subject, let's say, to the heaviest regulatory burden, they are pretty narrowly defined. I'm convinced that in the work that we'll do in the negotiations, we are going to try and be even more precise in order not to leave room for interpretation and not to create those burdens unnecessarily for those that might appear to be playing in that zone of risk, but in fact, through the effects of the applications, they are not indeed risky at all. So again, we are going to play over the next 2 years with this definition a lot in order to make sure that they are finding and hitting the right note in terms of definition of the scope of the applications. But if we look at the overall logic of the text, this is what I think it's important for us to retain. If you look at the overall logic of the text, the vast majority of applications will be escaping regulation in the positive sense. I mean, they would not be falling in the scope of this text. And I think that is a good thing because that, in fact, allows for creativity to go unchecked, unregulated, unburdened by this. Of course, the other elements will remain valid, which is access to money, access to testing capacities, access to data, talent, and so on and so forth. But again, at least we will not be having a negative effect to the regulation as such, with the proper duty of care on our side, of course, to make sure that we negotiate and that we draft it properly at the very end. Thank you.
Dragos, thank you. I would have a lot of comments to make on what you've said, but I won't do it because I don't want to take time from our speakers. However, one thing that I want to comment is that I know that Europe has placed a lot of emphasis on a strategy which places the AI use in Europe as an ethical one. But as we can see, the world is not fair, and it doesn't give a lot, let's say, on ethical use of technology. And probably this needs to be also maybe refined, rediscussed at the European level. I'm not saying to abandon this, but maybe not to put this at the center of everything that we are doing. I will move on now to Thomas. Thomas, you said in your opening that in your self-presentation that AI needs to be regulated. Does it really need to be regulated? Can you expand a little bit more on the subject? As you can see, this is very debatable at the moment.
Thank you very much, Andre. I will try to be very quick because we're running out of time. So I think if you look at the applications on the one hand and at the technology description on the other hand, there are two observations. One is when we look at the technology, we have a definition of AI currently in the proposal, which is in Annex 1, which is static, incomplete, I would say not agreeable among AI experts. And I would like to give at least evidence for one of those claims. We have a highly dynamic research field here, artificial intelligence, such that a static definition will be outdated very soon, actually as we speak. And secondly, it contains terms such as statistical approaches and optimization methods. Now, I'm myself an expert in at least the latter, optimization methods. And therefore, I think I can validly claim that we have to differentiate here between classical optimization algorithms, such as, for example, operations research, which has been in use for 60 years and is actually not at all related to artificial intelligence. It is actually not artificial intelligence. And that we need to be really careful here because that means that all of a sudden any application of operations research in logistics and supply chain, which has been around forever, as it affects critical infrastructure, would be high-risk AI. I think this is very dangerous to do it like this. We have to be much more careful how we define the technology. Second, a brief comment on applications. I personally think we should not regulate the technology. We should regulate the application side. In general, we should say applications of IT for certain areas should be regulated. You see where I'm coming from, because the definition of AI is fundamentally a problem as we have it right now in the Act. And it will never be complete. And indeed, there are other technologies which could also be used for biased scoring of people, for example, which are not classically called AI, but the application is what should really be regulated. I think this is really important to consider it from that end and to think about the applications which we would like to be classified as high risk or regulated, but not the technology. And having talked about this, the latest version that I looked at of the proposed AI Act that was still online said that for specific AI systems, and I'm citing from it right now, only minimum transparency obligations are proposed, in particular when chatbots and deepfakes are used. And honestly, I would consider deepfakes as some kind of high-risk artificial intelligence, especially given how they can be used to manipulate opinions of people. And therefore, I do believe that there is still even certain omissions in the proposed act, which should also be regulated. Last statement, I think the conformity assessment estimation costs, which are currently in the proposal, are fundamentally wrong. I've gone with my company through two certifications, and the total cost that we actually had to face for those two certifications were a significant 6-digit figure. And I can explain where that's coming from later on, but I think I don't have the time, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Thomas. Indeed, some important points. What I would like to emphasize here that, as you can see, Dragos, there are many good suggestions that are coming out from this kind of discussions, and maybe they should become part of a process that you as Parliament should have in place. I know, obviously, that there is a lot of consultation that is going on, but this very, concrete touch at the grassroots level, I think it's important to have real, honest feedback on your regulatory initiatives. I will move now to David. David, let's see also the let's say the good part, if it is one, the positive part of regulating AI. What do you see are the benefits for the SMEs in this initiative?
Thanks, Andre. And actually, I would like to take a couple of seconds to address the talent point that Dragos mentioned earlier, because that's something I feel extremely strongly about. I think talent is hard generally, and especially in the context of what we're discussing today, I think it needs immediate addressing if we want to avoid further brain drain. I've interviewed hundreds of people from around the world over the last years, hundreds of AI people, and one thing is clear: if you as an individual want to do something truly ambitious, and you are an AI person, you are going to where the most ambitious companies are, and where you can experiment with the coolest AI technologies, where the funding is available, and also where everyone shares that mindset. You don't go where you need to build infrastructure for compliance. So I think that's something really important to keep in mind: is how do we attract people to not be slowed down by what we are discussing here, and put them onto the problems that the most innovative companies want to work on in the next couple of years. Happy to discuss that in more detail at a later stage. I think there are interesting elements that we can implement. But to the benefits of the AI Act, I think we've mentioned a lot of things, and I don't want to repeat them. It is very clear that the general idea of the AI Act is a good one. And one thing that always sort of I find striking is, and there's little discussed, is that in many industries, we won't even get far without regulations. We won't get far without something like the AI Act. AI-specific regulations will be required to build groundbreaking products in medicine, in the mobility sector. And so we should rather move quickly to work on refining the regulatory proposals, work through concrete use cases, and make sure that we put especially the SMEs and the startups into a position where they have concrete guidelines, concrete guidance on a technical level, so that they can start actually building their products within these already regulated spaces. And again, I think if we get this right, the impact of something like the AI can be positive for SMEs in Europe, and really enabling them to build the products that they envision.
Okay, thank you, David. My next, I promise I will come back to this, but my next question it goes to Emilia. We know that the AI Act relies to a great extent on defining requirements via standards, and we already had some comments how appropriate it is to view AI through the lens of standards. As you're representing an SMEs in standardization, how can we best address the challenge of ensuring that the standards and requirements will fit the interests and capacities, especially the capacities of SMEs?
Thank you, Andre. This is a really important question from the technological perspective. Standardization is not new. We have standardization for the technical fields, and AI, it is a technical field, isn't it? We have it for all product services, and at other organization level, we always run at the international level. Entry to market is subject to compliance with existing standards and regulations. The standards, they represent the technical specification that support the geographically relevant, regulatory, and legal aspects. So we only provide support. For artificial intelligence, this is new. As for me, I come, as Thomas mentioned, I come with a researcher's background. So I come with more than 20 years of doing what we call nowadays artificial intelligence. My first delivery was for Harvard Medical School, femoral surgery, really different, 20 years ago, but we're doing AI. What changed is that AI goes to markets. And I do salute European approach, and I think it is beneficial for all SMEs, that we provide instruments of trust. So we are going to the market with a new technology, and we are moving among the first in building trust in this technology so that we can enable a trustworthy long-term approach on the European market. If we speak about what happens in standardizations, international standardization already started since 2018, 2017, standardizing AI, but not that many SMEs are present. And I will give a short look on that, which will be standards. They are required for any technological field. In research, we always apply trustworthy approach for the technology that we are making. Now we want to reassure and support the end user in having instruments that he can trust and he can use for its own benefit. If I'm looking a bit what standardization is doing, so we said, okay, that started in 2017. Standardization, artificial intelligence came in Europe for SENS and Senelec only in 2021, so quite late. But when it was needed, when it was required by the market, so it came from a market need. There were intensive studies beforehand, and based on that, we had the advent of standardization AI in Europe for SENS and Senelec. How we can ensure the SME presence? This is a struggle. We have, of course, support, and we are lucky to have the efforts that Digital SME already does in supporting SMEs by providing support to standardization, being one of the very few which exist. It is the only SME-related representative effort at the worldwide scale. If we look at the international standards in artificial intelligence, the only representation coming from SMEs comes from Europe. And why I think this is important, because the Euro strengths and what we're bringing is the multicultural perspective. We have the power of having several perspectives, and we have the power of resilience. And I see it reflected by SMEs as we do not rely, if we take the European economy, we do not rely on big players that much. We have a large percentage of the companies in Europe they are represented by SMEs. So we brought the flavor of SMEs and the voice of SMEs internationally, not only. And that enables the voice of SMEs to have an entry point also in the international market. Why I feel this is relevant? If we take standards, they will support, for example, they will support the CE marking, the seal of trust. So AI will be just a new technological layer, but it is not new that products and services, they are subject to standards. Because when we enter to the market, we need to comply with that, being the CE mark in Europe, being other seals of trust in the other territories. Now, how can we reinforce the presence of SMEs? That will be a question I will have. Of course, we have Digital SME, which is already doing a lot of efforts. And I myself, I'm one of the few presidents of national mirror committees and head of delegation for Luxembourg representing an SMEs. But there are tech representatives in standardization. There are many big players out there. So I'm a rare case, and we have Omar and Sebastiano, we have this strong support for SMEs, but is it enough? And this is a question I would like to open. How can we address this challenge, and how can we pragmatically support? And I'm sure the colleagues, Mislav and David, will trigger that. How can we support pragmatically with the sandboxes? And I will leave it for my colleagues because they have really relevant remarks on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Emilia. Indeed, an important point that you made, and there are very little initiatives of this kind across Europe and across the world. Otherwise, mostly this is unfortunately in the hands of big tech companies. I will move now quickly to Thomas. You talked about conformity assessments. How would you estimate the cost of compliance, and what could be the real impact on SMEs? You said that you have already went through a process like that, and I think you are the best to witness on this.
As I said before, thank you very much. As I said before, we have been going through 2 certifications recently. Remember, 8 people in a self-funded SME. The 2 certifications, it doesn't matter much whether I mention them or not, but it's an ISO 9001 and a so-called information security management system certification. In the Act, it somewhere says the compliance costs are estimated at about 10 to 15,000 euro altogether. That must be the cost for the audit itself only, meaning when the auditor is coming and when the auditor is questioning all the questions, interrogating the company, checking the system, then that's a cost which is in the range of 5 to 10K. Plus you get your certificate and so on. The preparation cost for this, meaning internal staff cost and external advisor cost, because you need to hire external advisors to help you through the whole process, they are like, that's my experience, 10 to 15 times that amount, which for an SME, as you can imagine, is very tricky. Long story short, I think it grossly underestimates these costs. In addition, in the documentation requirements already that I read in the Act, I can tell that this is a tremendous additional overhead, and it will increase the cost of a high-risk AI solution significantly. Now I could say, fortunately, we are not building high-risk AI solutions, but that's not an easy way out, right? And let me just make the following statement. Let's think a little bit about what that means, high-risk AI solutions. So one of the classifications in the end of the Act says that critical infrastructure, including water supply, is high-risk AI solution if AI is being deployed there. Now think about a company that does predictive maintenance for rotating equipment, including pumps, including water pumps. Now, immediately we have an AI model that does predictive maintenance forecasting for water pumps. If the water pump is deployed in a water supply system, which is critical infrastructure, You might not even know that, of course, but you have developed a AI model which is high-risk artificial intelligence because it's deployed in critical infrastructure and does predictive maintenance. So long story short, that also implies CE certification on top, which maybe not many SMEs have heard about. And I think, you know, the expansion of this without even knowing, because you might be building a solution that is developed for pumps. Now it ends up in water pumps. Now it's critical infrastructure. Now it's high-risk AI all of a sudden. Is very difficult to assess for SMEs. So long story short, certification costs are much higher than what the Act claims. And high-risk AI and CE certification and the implications are very difficult to assess, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, for giving witness to this process firsthand. I think that's an important feedback for everybody, and I see that there are a lot of people who agree with you in the chat as well. And a suggestion to Digital SME Alliance, maybe a short report on what has been discussed, and also the feedback from the chat and the people here would be helpful for Dragos. We are happy to contribute to that in any way we can. I will move on to and go back to Emilia once again. Do you think that the requirements formulated in the AI Act with regards to the quality of data is realistic? In your view, is there an overlap with other requirements stemming maybe from other regulations such as, I don't know, GDPR maybe, or Cybersecurity Act? What is your view on this?
Thank you, Andre. I will try to summarize from what we already had a summary in the focus group on AI from the Digital SME Alliance. The requirements which are regarding the data quality as they are defined in the current text, we have the Recital 44, page 29 and Article 10, they appear to be unrealistic as they are requiring for error-free and complete data, and this is difficult to define and identify. That makes it impossible for an SME on its own to completely comply. The AI value chain is quite large, isn't it? We have the producers of hardware, let's say, and then we have acquisition, and we have all the actors. We have different roles and responsibility. An SME can't fulfill all these roles. We need to look at the entire approach and see realistically what an SME could provide. Error-free, completely error-free. This is, of course, interesting, and I would recommend everyone to have a look at what the focus group on artificial intelligence published in this the white paper. So this is our response to the AI Act proposal, because there we have more details on that. Data quality is a difficult topic. An SME can't assume it itself only. There are different roles and responsibilities to be taken into account. And error-free and complete data, this is utopic because we are handling also approximation algorithms, isn't it? They are not exact methods. And I would stop here.
Thank you, Emilia. I think an important point that you made, and it's already encompassed in the white paper that the focus group on AI has put out there. So again, a good emphasis on this. David, we are going back to you now. In your opinion, what do we need to change in our approach to regulating AI if we want this to work for SMEs? And as we have concluded so far, we want this to work for European SMEs.
Of course. Thank you so much, Andre. So I would like to start by saying that from speaking to a lot of startups these days, they absolutely experience a massive information uncertainty right now. So they don't know how to interpret the European AI Act. They have to answer questions from their investors, which they don't have answers to right now. We mentioned that before as well. They are building software infrastructures, which they think are necessary to show compliance in the future, sinking costs into that without really knowing what regulations will require from them. So in some sense, everyone is waiting for the next steps. And the context as well is that both AI and these regulations that we are discussing here are both quickly evolving aspects. Building AI itself is incredibly hard. And especially SMEs, we mentioned that many times before, don't have the resources to cover both the complexities of AI and regulatory aspects that now come in addition to that. So I want to emphasize again that the danger is that only the Googles of the world can innovate. And so I think in terms of what needs to change, we should really think about how we can minimize the workload that that will hit these SMEs in the future. And how do we do that? I think a couple of directions, which I'm happy to discuss more in a follow-up session, is that we absolutely need to increase funding, financial funding that supports AI startups, innovative AI startups, and concrete use cases while we are going through these times of uncertainty. And we absolutely need to bring regulatory proposals down to practical guidelines for developers, something that development teams can follow. And we need to support European-wide building out the software tools that can help facilitate the processes and ultimately alleviate the burden from SMEs. So I would summarize my question with an increase in funding, which we've mentioned today, is absolutely necessary. Making the regulatory proposals more concrete to a point where developers and development teams know what to do. And ultimately, there's a lot we can do with software. And I think once we realize that we can do a lot with software, let's support building out the tools that we can then give out to all the SMEs, all the startups, and everyone else, so that they can successfully and efficiently go through the processes and the mechanisms that we are discussing here.
David, thank you very much. Indeed, I think you have made an important point here, and I will address this immediately with Dragos. But before that, I would also like to invite Mislav to say something about his experience in the US. You already mentioned that you have working experience, professional experience abroad or outside, let's say, the EU, both in US and in China. Care to expand maybe a little bit on this?
Yeah.
And on the idea of sandboxes also that has been discussed here and put forward by Dragos at the beginning.
Yeah, so like 13 years ago, I raised my first investment from investors here in Europe. And we were building this first legal digital currency in the world. And we spent half of the investment on like all the legal work, on like making sure that everybody who will actually use our currency will be safe and so on. And we still had like a lot of problems convincing clients to actually accept that kind of currency for different kind of payments. And then it became obvious that we just need to move away from Europe, and we moved the startup to US, to San Francisco. And I started to go to the investors there and I say, look, I have the first legal virtual currency in the world. It was like even before Bitcoin. And what I heard from them, I was just like astonished. They basically told me, legal, who cares if it's legal? Like no one uses your virtual currency. Like make sure that like, I don't know, millions of people are using it, that like millions of dollars are going through it. And then we'll all sit together. We'll see what kind of effects does your actually virtual currency have on society and economy. And then we'll decide, should we legalize it or should we ban it? But we don't want to stop you in your innovation process, because a week from now, maybe your idea will change. So why should many people actually spend time on that? Why should we spend money on that and so on when you're still trying to figure out what you want to do? And that's the moment when I realized like what means to have a real freedom. And you're basically not convincing your customers that it's safe, that it's okay, that nothing bad will happen and so on. Instead, you're focusing on like, how are we going to create value? Like, will customers like it? Like, will it create some new value that can be, so that we can actually charge for our services that can be sustainable and so on. And that's what we are missing in Europe right now. So I don't think we are missing talent. That's just a consequence. I don't think we are missing funding. That's again a consequence. We are missing a sense that you have opportunities here. If you have opportunities here, then the talent will come, the funding will come and so on, because people see that they'll be able to make money, that they'll be able to build companies and so on. So this was happening like 30 years ago. And if we see what Europe did in the last 30 years, when like the internet was the technology that was shaping the world, we can, and if we now take a look at like the 10 biggest companies by market capitalization right now in the world, we'll see that none of them comes actually from Europe. 8 out of 10 didn't exist like 30 years ago. 5 are big platforms actually from US. Another 3 are actually tech companies and so on. So we missed that wave completely. Why? Because we are constantly like sitting back and looking what's happening. And we didn't inspire anyone actually to take action. And similar is now happening with AI. First, my heart hurts when I hear that we are talking about AI as a digital being that can be regulated. It's just a tool. And if you apply it in one place or you apply it in it's a completely different thing. We shouldn't be calling it, oh, AI, let's find a way how to standardize AI, how to regulate AI, because it's complete nonsense. So for us, I think it's more strategically that we need to decide, like, are we going to be a land of opportunities, or we'll be just consumers of other people's tech, the same way as we are right now. Like, we lost the cloud battle, and we are consuming the cloud infrastructure. We lost the chips battle. Yeah, we are consuming it. It doesn't make any sense right now for us to actually make bad copies in Europe, to force people in Europe to use bad technology that's much more expensive and so on. It makes sense to actually admit defeat in certain areas and to say, let's use the best technology and let's build on top of that something new, better, that no one else has, and then sell it to the world. And what I think we can sell to the world is basically European core values. If you've lived in US and you felt the pressure, if you lived in China and you felt how people are treating you there, you know that all these people would love to be treated as people who are living in Europe. And that's something that can be scaled with AI. But not if we are completely in defensive mode, where I see that we already are just finding excuses for the loss. And that's what hurts me, because I don't think it's more funding, because when union funds companies, it just creates like a lot of fake companies that don't have market, that don't have product fit, that don't have that are not working on according to the market standards and so on. So it's more about like creating a safe environment for people to try to be innovative, and then supporting them by actually not constraining them. Because I know that if my technology hurts someone, I don't need AI Act for me to end up in jail. There are other laws already saying you build something that hurts someone and you'll end up in jail. But the fact that I need to waste so much time thinking about what other problems will I have because of AI Act, that's just like a huge inefficiency, I would say, at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Mislav, for your testimony. I would call it a testimony because you have seen, what is happening in other parts of the world, especially those that we consider benchmark in technology, and we know that things are treated differently. But as you said, also Europe has its appeal, and this, putting some core values at the heart of almost everything that we do here is part of who we are, and we cannot deny that totally. But we need to find the right balance here. And Dragos, I'm sorry to say, but a lot of this weight lies on your shoulders as the European Parliament. And I give the floor to you for some final thoughts. It's not a question. It's more like comments that you have referring to everything that has been said before. You have seen there are a lot of critical points that have been made. Some are crucial. There are many people commenting and supporting the speakers who have said the things that they have said in the conversation. I know, Annika, that we are somehow going beyond the time that we have had, but I think it's important to have the final feedback from Dragos. Dragos, please.
Thank you, Andrei. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Not easy with so many that was said. Probably the simplest way is to support and add my voice, in fact, to theirs, because a lot of what I've heard from you is actually things that I and many like me here in Parliament have been saying for these past 2-3 years since we focused on AI. And if you take a look, it's going to be available soon in the next 2 weeks, which is the final report of AIDA. You will see that starting from what Mislav was saying just now about where we are as Europe compared to the other markets and what actually still keeps us and holds us back compared to the environment in the other markets are things that you will find in our final report as AIDA. We're going to vote on it in the 3rd week of this month, and then it's going to be available. So again, simplest way is to add my voice to all these. Now, some more concrete reactions, feedback to what was said. I think first of all, in terms of process, Andrei, you mentioned that there are a lot of comments, not only today in the chat, but also contributions that come from many of the members of your alliance, and all of these are very welcome. In fact, over the last year, we've been collecting this feedback, we've been collecting your contributions and views. I've talked to, I don't know, I lost count of how many representatives of everything from micro businesses to big businesses in the quest, which is not an easy one, to actually complete a broad view as to what actually is expected and what we should do with this legislation. I know that your reference point right now in conversation is the proposal of the Commission. Of course, you don't have another one. But clearly, this proposal will need to be changed in many respects in order to actually cater properly for the realities in the market, for the realities that we need to serve with this legislation. So, again, this exercise, just like all the other contributions, the work that you've done, is a very, very useful one for me, working on this text, still completing my views on this text over the coming 2 weeks, more or less. Beginning of April, we'll have the first draft coming from myself and from the co-rapporteur, Brando Benifei, representing the Internal Market Committee. Again, this work is not lost, and your views and your contributions and your questions and your concerns are not lost, because they are completing our understanding, our education as to what needs to be done. Of course, we'll need to keep a look on the future, something that Thomas was saying about the fact that if you look at the definition in the Commission's proposal is already outdated. Yes, I do think that we need to work on the definition, and we need to find a way to future-proof as much as we can this text. It's not going to be an easy exercise, but something that at least I personally want to do is to take as much of the definitions, as much as the use cases that are being part of the scope of this text to the annexes, in order to make it easier to inject flexibility, in order to make it easier to adapt them as, in fact, the technology evolves. Otherwise, if we end up with a static piece of text that is going to take a look at, in fact, we take a look at where we are now, or maybe where we were yesterday, we're going to end up in 2 years adopting it, but then in the meantime, the technology has moved 100 times faster. So again, the possibility to keep on adapting, prototyping even, this text as the technology evolves is going to be key to the success of this regulation in actually addressing the needs of the market. So again, I'm taking this to heart, and it's something that we will need to do, including also a way to regulate and to draft these definitions so that they actually do not apply to the technology itself, which I agree with all of you saying that the technology itself is a tool and needs to be regarded as a neutral tool, as a neutral piece of kit, if you want. It is the effects of this kit, the used cases, the used applications of this kit that need to be addressed through regulation if they fall into the categories of risk and so on and so forth. So, but again, we will need to be very careful on how we draft these things so that it's clear. Same thing for data quality and for the requirements of the data that is being used to feed algorithms. The same thing for predictability of norms. I think David was saying that, and I fully agree. We're going to have to be very careful in how we write these requirements, because the way they're going to be translated into technical requirements by the engineers that are going to work with this is going to be key. You're also saying, David, rightfully so, how do we measure bias? How do we measure fairness? We say that they need to be fair, they need to be unbiased, and so on and so forth, but how do we measure them? Interestingly, and I think it's also evident, it shows, in fact, there is a preoccupation also at the level of the regulators for that. The one concrete project which we now have as part of the Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, the transatlantic framework that we now use between the US and the EU to work on a key number of points, including AI, and the agreement back in September when the leaders met in Pittsburgh for the TTC was that we will find concrete projects to work on. Well, I can tell you that one of the concrete projects that the EU experts are working together with the US experts is how to measure bias. How to measure bias so that we can actually then be very clear when we are going to write standards on this, what actually is expected and how would you need to develop your, and to know when you actually fall in with the application into a possible risk zone. So again, all of this is something that is on our table, is part of our concern, is things that we are going to try and put in the amendments that we're going to bring to the text, and part of the work and the negotiations that will follow. So I'll stop here. Again, thanks a lot for your contributions. I've taken a lot of notes. And also, if you have written contributions on top of what you've contributed already, also as part of the white paper exercise, and after, they're going to be put to good use. Thanks a lot for all of the contributions and for helping me host this conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Dragos. Thank you for being here with us. I will conclude here, but the meeting is not quite over. I will hand it over to Annika. And Annika, I will also leave it up to you if you want to pick up maybe a question or some observation or contribution made through the chat. Thank you very much again, the Digital SME Alliance, for giving me the opportunity to moderate this very, very interesting discussion. Annika, please.
Thank you very much, Andre, for taking over this important role. And also, I would like to thank Mr. MEP Tudorache for having hosted this debate, for really giving us the opportunity to bring in the voices of SMEs. I have the honor to sum up, to close this event. I'm coordinating the focus group Artificial Intelligence. I've set it up together with my colleagues and have been working with the companies from this group over the past 1.5 to 2 years to develop joint activities to come up with our position on this important legislative proposal. And I think, Ms. MEP Tudorache, what you've given us here is really an opportunity to have a platform to voice our concerns and to bring these to the attention. So this is really important, and I cannot thank you enough for doing this, for hosting this debate. And as has been pointed out by Andre, would be more than glad to stay in contact to follow up on this, to send you our finalized report as well as our fact sheet. I have put the fact sheet also into the chat, so you can have access here, everyone who has been listening and taking part in this. It summarizes the concerns that have been raised. At the same time, I would like to invite everyone who has been listening, who has been in the chat, active in the chat, to join our focus group, Artificial Intelligence. If you're an SME in Europe, you want to get involved in this discussion, please join. It is available for free. You can take part in our monthly meetings, and we're more than happy to welcome all of you there. As we're already over time, I would like to close now. I would like to thank everyone for your important contributions. There have been really excellent contributions made by everyone here. Yeah, some of them are going to be sticking with me, like the question if we really want to inspire with AI, or if what is really our aim. Do we want to inspire, or do we want to find means of compliance? And I think the answer should be we want to inspire. So how can we do that? How can we do that together is going to be one of the questions I think we'll have to answer. And with that, yes, thank you to everyone, and looking forward to staying in touch. Bye.